They were a menace, John. I did you a favor. Now your property finally looks clean. The words, slick with a horrifying mixture of condescension and self-satisfaction, slithered from the mouth of Karen Bishop, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She stood on my lawn, a floral muumuu stretched taut over her plus-size frame, her arms crossed as if she were admiring a freshly painted fence instead of the 4 gaping wounds in the earth where my life's anchors had been. 4 colossal stumps, their raw, pale faces turned to the morning sky, wept sap like tears. The air, usually filled with the clean scent of dew on grass and the earthy perfume of walnut leaves, was thick with the acrid smell of chainsaw oil and butchered wood. My black walnut trees were gone. Not just trees, they were titans, each over a century old, their canopies a cathedral under which my late wife, Sarah, and I had planned our future, raised our daughter, and dreamed of growing old. They were the one condition Sarah had for buying this house 25 years ago. The living monuments she fell in love with before she even stepped inside. And now they were just gone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner in the cage of my chest. Each beat a shockwave of pure, unadulterated rage that threatened to overwhelm the discipline forged in 25 years as a Marine Master Gunnery Sergeant. My hands, curled into fists so tight my knuckles were white, trembled with the desperate need to do something loud, something final, but I locked it down. I locked it all down behind a wall of ice, my face a mask of cold calm. I looked from the carnage on my lawn to her smug, fleshy face, her eyes glittering with the petty triumph of a tyrant who had just squashed a minor rebellion. "You did this?" I asked, my voice dangerously low, a growl rumbling just beneath the surface. She actually puffed out her chest. "I had it done. As president of the HOA, I am authorized to remove any nuisance vegetation that violates community aesthetic standards, as per bylaw 7.4. Those trees dropped walnuts all over the street. They were a hazard to vehicles, and their leaves were a constant mess. We have standards here, John." She said it like she was reciting scripture, a zealot of beige siding and uniform lawn height. A hazard. These trees had stood here since before this state was a state, surviving hurricanes and droughts, and she called them a hazard because Alexis might have to drive over a nut. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was breathtaking. I felt a dizzying wave of loss, so profound it was a physical blow. Thinking of Sarah and how she would talk to the trees, her hand resting on their gnarled bark. Now they were just firewood. And this woman, this petty dictator of cul-de-sacs, was proud of it. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken violence. I could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The first crack in her armor of entitlement as she registered that the quiet veteran next door was not wilting under her authority. He was calcifying. He was becoming something hard and sharp. The opening salvo of a war had been fired in the dead of night, not with artillery, but with a chainsaw, and she had no earthly idea of the hell she had just unleashed. If you've ever had to deal with an HOA run by a power-tripping nightmare, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because you're going to want to see how this ends. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, or share your own HOA horror story. I promise you, what happened next was a masterclass in methodical, cold, and calculated revenge. Now let me take you back to how it all started. It wasn't just the trees. It never is. The war with Karen began subtly, a series of small skirmishes that I, foolishly, had dismissed as the petty annoyances of suburban life. It started with a notice about my mailbox being 2 inches too low, then a formal warning about the brand of my trash can, which was not on the approved list of 3 vendors. Each letter was a paper-thin slice, a tiny cut designed to remind you who was in charge. I was a widower, living alone in a house that was now 3 sizes too big, but it was my home. It was where my daughter took her first steps, where Sarah planted her rose garden, where the ghosts of my happiest memories lived. After retiring from the Corps, I wanted quiet. I wanted peace. I wanted to sit on my porch and watch the seasons change in the leaves of those magnificent trees. Karen and her HOA board were the antithesis of peace. They thrived on conflict, on the enforcement of arcane rules that serve no purpose other than to consolidate their own power. My refusal to engage, my quiet compliance of lowering the mailbox and ordering a new trash can, seemed to enrage her more than any argument would have. She wanted subjugation, not cooperation. She wanted me to fear the crisp white envelope of the HOA newsletter in my mailbox. The trees were the final frontier. She had mentioned them in passing at a community barbecue a year prior, her voice dripping with faux concern. Such a shame they're so messy, John. A real liability. I had simply smiled, a tight, dismissive gesture, and said, Sarah loved them. I thought that would be the end of it, that the mention of my deceased wife would be enough to trigger some vestige of human decency. I was wrong. Decency was not a currency Karen Bishop traded in. Her currency was power, and my 4 black walnut trees, standing proud and defiant of her sterile vision, were a direct challenge to her reign. They were a patch of wilderness she could not tame, a testament to a time before her meticulously planned community was carved out of the North Carolina woods. So she had them executed in the dark, like a coward, and then stood on my lawn in the morning sun to boast about the kill. My first call wasn't to a lawyer, it was to the sheriff's department. I was a man of order, of process. I wanted a record. I wanted a report. I wanted the law to see what I was seeing, to bear witness to this violation before I took matters into my own hands. The confrontation on the lawn was just the beginning. I stood there, letting her words hang in the air, a monument to her own arrogance. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of chainsaw exhaust filling my lungs, and I let the cold fury inside me settle, sharpening from a blunt instrument of rage into a precision weapon. You're going to regret this, Karen, I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. You have no idea what you've just done. Her sneer was her only reply before she turned and waddled back to her own immaculate property, leaving me alone with the ghosts of my trees and the birth of a promise. A promise of absolute, unequivocal, and legally binding retribution. The young sheriff's deputy who responded had a sympathetic face but a weary posture that told me he'd seen this movie before. He walked the perimeter of my property, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth churned up by the heavy equipment. He took notes in a small spiral-bound pad as I recounted the morning's confrontation with Karen. So she admitted to having them cut down? He asked, looking up from his notes, his pen poised. Admitted it. She boasted about it, I corrected him, my voice tight. Cited some HOA bylaw. 7.4, she said. Nuisance vegetation. The deputy sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of resignation. Sir, I understand your frustration, I really do. This is a terrible thing to have happened, but if she's claiming she did it under the authority of the HOA, even if she's wrong, this is likely going to be a civil matter. A civil matter. The 2 words every victim of a crime dreads hearing from law enforcement. It was the official-sounding way of saying, you're on your own, buddy. He explained that since she wasn't denying her involvement and was claiming a form of legal right through the HOA covenants, it wasn't a straightforward criminal case of property destruction or trespassing. It was a dispute over contractual obligations and property rights. So you're not going to arrest her? I asked, the question coming out colder than I intended. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. For what, sir? We can't arrest someone for a bylaw dispute. We can file a report, and I will. I'll document everything you've told me. I'll go over and talk to her, get her statement. But my sergeant is going to tell me the same thing. This is for the lawyers to sort out. I nodded slowly, the ice in my veins spreading. It was exactly what I expected. But hearing it confirmed was a critical step. The system wasn't built for swift justice. It was built for process. Fine. I knew process. The Marine Corps is nothing if not a machine of process. This was just a different kind of war. One fought not with rifles, but with reports, depositions, and meticulously organized evidence. As the deputy walked across the street to Karen's beige McMansion, I turned back to my ravaged yard and began my own process. I went back inside, the smell of sawdust clinging to my clothes, and retrieved the digital camera I kept for family occasions. I walked back out and began documenting. I didn't just take a few quick snaps. I conducted a full site survey. I took wide shots of the entire front yard, showing the 4 stumps in relation to the house, the street, the property lines. I took medium shots of each individual stump, capturing the fresh cut marks, the diameter, the sawdust sprayed across the grass. I took close-ups, macro shots of the wood grain, the color of the sap, the brutal tearing marks left by the chainsaw teeth. I photographed the deep tire tracks carved into my lawn, evidence of a heavy truck, likely with a crane or lift. I photographed the stray wood chips scattered across the driveway and the street. I took over 200 photographs, each one a silent, damning witness. Next, I went to my garage. I pulled out a box of evidence bags I had from God knows where. I walked to each stump and collected a sample of the wood, a handful of sawdust, and a few of the stray leaves that had been knocked to the ground. I sealed each bag, labeled it with the date, time, and location. Stump number 1, northwest corner, stump number 2, northeast corner, and so on. My hands were steady, my movements precise. The grief was still there, a hot coal in my gut, but it was being banked by a cold, clear sense of purpose. This was a mission now. Objective, justice. While I worked, I saw the deputy leaving Karen's house. He trudged back across the street, his shoulders slumped a little lower than before. "Well, she confirmed it," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Said the board approved it, and she was acting in her official capacity. Showed me a copy of the bylaw. Told me you'd been warned." "I was never warned," I stated flatly. "She mentioned it once, in passing, at a barbecue a year ago. There has been no official letter, no formal warning, no written notice of any kind." "I'll put that in my report," he said, the phrase already starting to sound like a hollow platitude. He handed me a card with a case number on it. "Your copy of the report will be available in 3 to 5 business days." "I'm sorry, Mr. Davis. I wish I could do more." I took the card and nodded. "You did your job, Deputy. Thank you." He retreated to his cruiser, and I was alone again with the carnage. The sun was higher now, casting harsh shadows across the violated landscape of my front yard. Neighbors peered from behind their curtains, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. They knew who was responsible. They knew who was next. My next step was crucial. I needed an expert. I needed an independent valuation of what I had lost. I went inside, sat down at the desk in my study, and opened my laptop. The search term was simple: Certified Arborist, North Carolina, High-Value Timber Appraisal. The first result was for a company called a name that sounded promising: Legacy Tree Consultants. Their website spoke of expertise in heritage trees, timber valuation for legal and insurance purposes, and expert witness testimony. I called the number. A calm, professional voice answered. "Legacy Tree, this is Dr. Evans." I explained my situation, my voice steady and factual. I described the trees, mature black walnuts, over 80 feet tall, with straight, clear trunks at least 30 inches in diameter. I described their condition before they were cut: healthy, vibrant, with full canopies. Dr. Evans was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Davis, I'm clearing my afternoon schedule. I can be at your property by 2 p.m. Is that acceptable?" The urgency in his voice was the first external validation I had received all day. It was the sound of a professional who understood that something more than just a couple of backyard trees had been destroyed. It was the sound of someone who knew what a century-old black walnut was worth. As I waited for him to arrive, I logged every action I had taken in a fresh notebook. 7:15, discovered trees. 7:30, confronted K. Bishop. 8:10, called sheriff. 8:45, Deputy Rourke arrived. 10:15, photographed scene. 10:45, collected samples. 11, contacted Dr. Evans. Every detail, no matter how small, was recorded. This notebook would become my Bible, my tactical operations center for the war to come. This wasn't just about money. It was about legacy. It was about a promise I made to my wife, and it was about dismantling the petty tyranny of a woman who thought rules gave her the right to be cruel. The battle lines had been drawn, not in the dirt of a foreign field, but right here on the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge Estates. And I was preparing for a long and punishing campaign. Dr. Alistair Evans arrived at precisely 2 p.m., driving a modest but well-kept pickup truck. He was a man in his late 60s, tall and wiry, with kind eyes crinkled by years of looking up into canopies and a handshake as firm and dry as old bark. He carried a heavy-duty clipboard and a leather satchel filled with specialized tools. He didn't say much at first, simply nodding as I led him to the front yard. He walked a slow, deliberate circle around the 4 stumps, his eyes taking in everything: the spray of the sawdust, the condition of the surrounding lawn, the angle of the cuts. He knelt at the first stump, running his hand over the raw wood. He pulled a strange-looking device from his bag, a core borer, and with a few practiced twists, extracted a long, thin cylinder of wood from the stump. He examined it with a jeweler's loupe, counting the rings, observing their width and consistency. "Healthy," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Very healthy. Good, consistent growth for decades." He repeated the process at each of the 4 stumps, his movements economical and precise. He measured the diameter of each stump at multiple points. He took soil samples. He referenced the photos I had taken on my camera, nodding in approval. "Excellent documentation, Mr. Davis. This is exactly what's needed." Finally, after nearly an hour of silent, methodical work, he stood up, wiped his hands on a cloth, and looked at me. "Master Gunnery Sergeant," he said, his eyes meeting mine with a new level of seriousness. I hadn't told him my rank. He must have seen a plaque or a photo on his way through the house. The use of my title wasn't an attempt to ingratiate himself. It was a sign of respect, a recognition of a shared language of discipline and order. "What you have here," he began, his voice low and grave, "is a travesty, an absolute butchery of 4 prime specimens of Wugglan's nigra." He explained that black walnut, especially of this size and quality, was one of the most valuable hardwoods in North America. The value was determined by a combination of factors: the diameter of the trunk, the height of clear, straight wood before the first major branch, what he called the log, the quality of the grain, and the absence of defects. "Based on the stump diameters and the photographs you took showing their height," he said, flipping through pages of notes on his clipboard, "I can tell you that each of these trees would have yielded at least 2, possibly 3, veneer-quality logs. We're talking about wood used in high-end furniture, architectural paneling, luxury car interiors, and firearm stocks." My mind was reeling. I had always known they were beautiful, majestic trees. I had no idea they were a commodity of this magnitude. "So, what does that mean?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "In terms of value?" "Doctor." Evans took a deep breath. "Mr. Davis, a formal appraisal requires lab analysis of the core samples and cross-referencing with current timber market data, which I will conduct. But my preliminary on-site field estimate, which I believe to be conservative, is that you have lost a minimum of $65,000. Per tree." The number hung in the air, a physical weight. $65,000 times 4, $260,000, $250,000 in timber, gone. Wiped out overnight on the whim of a petty tyrant in a muumuu. I felt a fresh wave of cold fury wash over me, but this time it was different. It was focused. This was no longer just a violation of my peace and a desecration of my wife's memory. This was grand larceny. "The replacement cost," he continued, "is, for all practical purposes, incalculable. You cannot buy a 120-year-old tree. The best you could do is plant a sapling and wait a century. The courts recognize this, which is why they often use the timber value or appraised value in these cases. And in North Carolina, we have a timber trespass statute. If someone knowingly and unlawfully cuts down another person's trees, the court can award treble damages." Treble damages. The words echoed in my mind. 3 times the value. The number in my head swelled from $260,000 to $780,000. It was a staggering, almost incomprehensible figure. As Dr. Evans packed up his tools, promising a full, notarized report within 48 hours, I received another gift from my nemesis. Stuffed into the handle of my front door was a crisp white envelope from the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. My hands were shaking slightly as I tore it open. It was a formal notice of violation, a fine, for $100. The reason stated: failure to remove felled timber and associated debris from property in a timely manner. They had cut down my trees without permission, and now they were fining me for the mess they had made. The sheer unmitigated audacity of it was almost comical. It was a declaration of war, signed and delivered. That evening I sat in my study, the violation notice lying on the desk next to my logbook. The house was too quiet. The familiar rustle of leaves that had been the soundtrack to my evenings for 25 years was gone, replaced by an unnerving silence. I opened the thick binder that contained the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC&Rs. It was a document I'd received at closing and promptly filed away, assuming it was filled with boilerplate nonsense about lawn maintenance and holiday decorations. Now I read it like a battlefield map, searching for the enemy's weaknesses. I found the bylaw Karen had cited, 7.4 nuisance. It was vaguely worded, a masterpiece of bureaucratic ambiguity. It stated the Architectural Control Committee could require the removal of any tree, shrub, or other vegetation, which is, in the sole discretion of the committee, unhealthy, unsightly, or otherwise a nuisance. Sole discretion. Those were the two words her entire kingdom was built on. But as I read further, I found other clauses. I found Section 12.1, which required a minimum of 14 days written notice to the homeowner for any mandated property alteration. I found Section 12.3, which guaranteed the homeowner the right to appeal any decision by the committee to the full HOA board. I found Section 15.8, which stipulated that any expenditure over $5,000 required a formal vote of the board, recorded in the meeting minutes. There had been no written notice, no opportunity to appeal. And I would bet my pension that the cost of hiring a crew with heavy equipment to take down 4 massive trees in the middle of the night was well over $5,000. She hadn't just bent the rules. She had shattered them. She was so drunk on her sole discretion that she had ignored every procedural safeguard in her own governing documents. My next call was to a man I hadn't spoken to in years, but whose number was saved in my phone under Fixer. Marcus Thorne, a former JAG officer who had served with me in Iraq, now a partner at a Raleigh law firm. His specialty was contract litigation, but his passion was, in his own words, making bullies pay. I dialed the number. He answered on the second ring. "Gunny," he said, his voice warm but sharp. "It's been too long. Don't tell me you finally decided to sue the VA." "Something better, Marcus," I said, looking at the fine notice on my desk. "I'm going to need you to dismantle an HOA." There was a pause and then a low chuckle on the other end of the line. "Gunny," he said, "you just made my whole year." Marcus Thorne operated out of a sleek office in downtown Raleigh, a space of glass in the steel that seemed a world away from the dusty FOBs where we'd first met. But beneath the $1,000 suit and the corner office view, he was still the same sharp, tenacious JAG captain who could dissect a flawed enemy combatant report or a convoluted rule of engagement with equal ferocity. I sat across his wide mahogany desk, a file folder in front of me. Inside was everything: my logbook, the hundreds of photos, the evidence bags, the sheriff's report number, the fine from the HOA, and a copy of the CC and RS with the relevant sections highlighted. Marcus listened without interruption as I laid out the entire sequence of events, from Karen's barbecue comment a year ago to the fine I'd received for the debris she had created. His face remained neutral, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers. "She cited bylaw 7.4, sole discretion," he mused, a faint smile playing on his lips. "They always love that one. It's the petty tyrant's favorite clause. They think sole discretion means absolute power. They're wrong." He picked up the copy of the CC and RS and flipped through it. "You've already done half my job for me, John. You've identified the procedural violations. No written notice under 12.1. No right to appeal under 12.3. And the big one, the one that's going to hang her, the expenditure limit in 15.8. He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "The key here is that she didn't just wrong you. She likely wronged the HOA itself. An HOA board president has a fiduciary duty to the members. That means they have to act in good faith, with prudence, and in the best interests of the association. Hiring a crew for a clandestine, overnight demolition without a board vote and in violation of your own bylaws is the polar opposite of that. She exposed every single member of your HOA to massive liability. It was a perspective I hadn't fully considered. I was so focused on my personal loss that I hadn't seen the bigger picture. Karen hadn't just attacked me. She had put all her neighbors, her subjects, at financial risk. So what's our strategy? I asked. Marcus's smile returned, this time with a predatory edge. We don't fire a shot, not yet. A lawsuit is a bazooka, John. You don't use it to kill a snake when you can let the snake crawl into a trap and kill itself. Right now, Karen thinks she's won. She thinks you're going to get angry, maybe yell at her at the next board meeting, and eventually pay the fine. We let her think that. We want her to get more arrogant. We want her to create an even longer paper trail of her own malfeasance. His advice was counterintuitive to the rage burning in my gut, but it resonated with my military training. Don't attack a fortified position head-on. Use reconnaissance. Find the weak points. Let the enemy overextend. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, Marcus continued, his tone shifting to a mock-dramatic whisper, is to become the quiet, aggrieved victim. You will not argue with her. You will not respond to her provocations. But you will start talking to your neighbors. Quietly, sympathetically. You're not the first person she's done this to, I guarantee it. There's a pattern. We just need to uncover it. He was right. I'd lived in Oak Ridge for 25 years, but I'd kept to myself, especially since Sarah passed. I was the quiet guy at the end of the cul-de-sac. Now I had to become a reluctant community organizer. My first conversation was with Tom and Jenna Miller, who lived 2 doors down. They had a daughter, Lily, who used a wheelchair. 2 years ago, Tom, a skilled carpenter, had built a beautiful, custom-designed swing set in their backyard, complete with a wheelchair-accessible ramp and a specialized adaptive swing. It was Lily's favorite place in the world. 3 months after it was built, they got a notice from Karen. The swing set, she claimed, was a non-compliant structure under a bylaw that prohibited outbuildings not approved by the Architectural Control Committee. Tom had appealed, arguing it was playground equipment, not an outbuilding. He'd even gotten a letter from Lily's physical therapist explaining its therapeutic benefits. Karen had been unmoved. She'd put it to a board vote, which she controlled, and the removal order was upheld. They were given 30 days to dismantle it or face daily fines. We couldn't afford the fight, Tom told me, his voice thick with a shame that wasn't his to bear. We were standing in his backyard looking at the empty patch of grass where the swing set used to be. The fines would have been hundreds of dollars a week. We had to take it down. It broke Lily's heart. Next, I spoke to Mrs. Gable, an 80-year-old widow who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built. Her front garden was her pride and joy, a riot of color and whimsy. Her crime? A collection of garden gnomes. Karen had declared them tacky and a violation of the aesthetic code. For the past 6 months, Mrs. Gable had been receiving a weekly fine of $25 for non-compliant lawn ornamentation. She had paid over $600 in fines already, a significant chunk of her fixed income. I've had those gnomes for 40 years, she told me, her voice trembling with indignation. My husband, George, gave me the first one. They're my friends. She wants me to throw away my friends. The pattern was clear. It wasn't about rules, it was about control. It was about breaking people's spirits, forcing them to erase the small, personal touches that made a house a home, and replacing them with Karen's sterile beige conformity. My most important discovery came from a name Tom Miller gave me, David Chen. David was a CPA who had served as the HOA treasurer for 3 years before resigning abruptly the previous year. I found him working in his garage restoring an old Triumph motorcycle. He was wary at first, but when I told him what had happened to my trees, his face hardened. I'm not surprised, he said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. That's Karen's M.O. Overstep, then bury the opposition in fines and procedure. I quit because I couldn't be complicit in her financial abuses anymore. He invited me inside and showed me files he had kept, meeting minutes that had been altered after the fact, budgets that showed tens of thousands of dollars in landscaping and legal consultation fees paid to companies owned by her brother-in-law. He told me about the board meetings she would hold with just 2 of her cronies to push through controversial measures, deliberately failing to notify other board members. The tree removal, he said, his eyes narrowing. I'd bet my license she paid for it out of the reserve fund without a vote, and I bet she used her brother-in-law's new stump-grinding business to do it. It's not just abuse of power, John. It's embezzlement. It's fraud. Armed with these stories, with this evidence of a reign of terror, I returned to Marcus. I laid out the new files on his desk. He looked through David's documents, a slow, wolfish grin spreading across his face. "Oh, this is beautiful," he whispered. "This is a pattern of racketeering. This isn't just a civil suit anymore, John. We're in RICO territory." The trap was set, and Karen, blissfully unaware, was about to escalate her way right into it. Karen, sensing a shift in the neighborhood's subtle currents, did exactly what Marcus predicted. She doubled down. She mistook my strategic silence for weakness, my quiet conversations with neighbors for impotent grumbling. Her arrogance, a formidable fortress, had no room for the possibility of a coordinated counteroffensive. Her first move was to use her personal propaganda machine, the Oak Ridge Estates monthly newsletter. Tucked between an announcement for the annual potluck and a reminder to keep trash cans out of sight was a thinly veiled attack on me. It was titled, "A Note on Community Responsibility." Without using my name, she wrote about certain residents who failed to maintain their properties to community standards, leading to necessary but costly interventions by the board. She painted a picture of a benevolent HOA forced to act to protect property values from the negligence of a single bad apple. She lamented the divisive attitude of homeowners who questioned the board's good faith efforts and who failed to appreciate the hard work that went into maintaining the neighborhood's pristine character. The most galling line was the last one. "We must all remember that the community's needs outweigh the selfish desires of any one individual." She was framing the destruction of my property as a selfless act for the greater good. It was masterful gaslighting. I read it and felt a flicker of the old rage, but it was quickly extinguished by a cold, calculating satisfaction. This was evidence. This was Exhibit A in her campaign of defamation. I carefully scanned the newsletter and emailed it to Marcus with the subject line, "More fuel." His reply was instantaneous. "Perfect. She's trying to poison the jury pool, and she's doing it in writing." Her next attack was more direct. I received a certified letter, a sure sign of escalating hostilities in the world of suburban warfare. It was a final notice of intent to file a lien. My original $100 fine for the debris on my property had now, with the addition of late fees, administrative charges, and legal review costs, a laughable fiction, ballooned to $750. The letter stated that if the amount was not paid within 10 days, the HOA would place a lien on my property, a black mark on my title that would prevent me from selling or refinancing my home. It was her nuclear option, the ultimate tool of coercion. Many homeowners, terrified by the legal implications of a lien, would have immediately capitulated and written the check. They would have paid the extortion money just to make the problem go away. But I wasn't many homeowners. I was a man with a team. I forwarded the letter to Marcus. His response was a single sentence: "Let her do it." He explained that filing a lien based on a fraudulent, bad faith fine was illegal. It would be another count in our growing indictment against her. It was like she was gleefully loading the gun we planned to use against her and then handing it to us. The trap was getting bigger and the bait more enticing. The pinnacle of her hubris came a week later. I received an email sent to the entire HOA mailing list announcing an emergency board meeting to be held in 2 days. The stated purpose was to vote on a special assessment to cover unforeseen legal and landscaping expenditures. She was going to make the entire community pay for her legal defense against me and for the illegal destruction of my trees. But her true goal, as David Chen quickly pointed out to me, was buried in the agenda. Item 2B, vote on proposed amendments to CC&RS, including clarification of Bylaw 7.4 and streamlining of violation enforcement protocols. She was trying to retroactively change the rules to justify her actions. She wanted to amend the bylaws to explicitly grant the president unilateral authority to remove nuisance trees without notice and to fast-track the lien process. She was rewriting the law to make her crimes legal after the fact. David's email to me was frantic. "This is it, John. This is her power grab. She's using the threat of your lawsuit to scare everyone into giving her more power. She only gave 48 hours notice, which is a violation of the 7-day notice rule for bylaw amendments, but she'll claim the emergency nature of the meeting justifies it. We have to stop this. My first instinct was to storm into that meeting with Marcus and drop the legal hammer. But Marcus's voice on the phone was a steadying influence. No, we don't play on her turf, by her rules. We let her have her sham meeting. We let her pass her illegal amendments. We let her get the votes from her cronies. Every procedural violation, every bad faith action is another nail in her coffin. Let her build it herself. So I did nothing. I didn't attend the meeting. David told me later it was a farce. Only a dozen homeowners showed up. Karen, flanked by her 2 loyalist board members, a retired car salesman named Gary, and a woman named Brenda, who seemed to have no personality of her own, controlled the proceedings. She spun a tale of a rogue homeowner threatening the financial stability of the entire community with a frivolous lawsuit. She claimed the special assessment was necessary to protect their property values. She rushed through the vote on the bylaw amendments, ramming them through with the slimmest of majorities from the few people in the room. She left that meeting feeling victorious, convinced she had shored up her defenses and consolidated her power. She had no idea that she had just walked deeper into the legal kill zone Marcus and I had prepared for her. The next day, I had the stumps professionally ground down, and the last remnants of my beautiful trees were hauled away. I paid the bill myself. I then sent a polite registered letter to the HOA board, formally disputing the $750 fine and the lien, citing the procedural violations in the CC and RS, and reserving all my legal rights. It was a calm, formal, and legally precise letter drafted by Marcus. It was the first official shot across her bow. It was a signal that the reconnaissance phase was over. The time for quiet observation was ending. The counterattack was about to begin. Karen had built her fortress of lies and illegal procedure. Now we were going to dismantle it, brick by brick. The time for clandestine maneuvering was over. Marcus and I had allowed Karen to overextend, to build a comprehensive, self-incriminating record of her own malfeasance. Now it was time to pivot from defense to offense. The first move was a formal, legal one, designed to freeze the battlefield and preserve the evidence we knew she would try to destroy. Marcus drafted a litigation hold and demand for preservation of records letter. It was a formidable-looking document, printed on heavy legal stationery and sent via certified mail to Karen's home address, as well as to the personal addresses of every other member of the HOA board. The letter formally notified them of our intent to file a lawsuit for damages related to the destruction of my trees, breach of fiduciary duty, defamation, and a host of other claims. Its primary purpose, however, was to legally obligate them to preserve every single piece of potential evidence. This included all emails, text messages, meeting minutes, both draft and final versions, financial records, invoices, contracts with vendors, and any other form of communication related to me, my property, or the HOA's governance. The letter explicitly warned that the destruction or alteration of any such records from that moment forward would be considered spoliation of evidence, an offense that carried severe penalties in court, including the judge potentially issuing an instruction to the jury to assume the destroyed evidence was unfavorable to them. This is the legal equivalent of chaining the filing cabinets shut, Marcus explained. She's a document shredder, I can feel it. This letter puts her on notice that if she tries to cover her tracks now, she's committing a fresh crime that I can and will use against her. As we suspected, the letter sent a shockwave through the board. While Karen might have been arrogant enough to dismiss it, the other members, the car salesman Gary, the meek Brenda, and the 2 others who just went along with everything, were suddenly confronted with the reality of their own personal liability. Their names were on a legal document that spoke of lawsuits and evidence spoliation. For the first time, it wasn't just about Karen's crusade against me, it was about their own homes, their own savings. David Chen, our inside source, confirmed the panic. He'd gotten a call from the board's new treasurer, a man who had replaced him and was now in way over his head. The man was terrified. Karen had instructed him to clean up the books related to the tree removal, and he now had a legal letter telling him that doing so could land him in serious trouble. The seeds of dissent were beginning to sprout within Karen's own ranks. While the legal hold was freezing the official records, David provided us with the key to the past. He had kept meticulous copies of the board's financial statements and meeting minutes from his time as treasurer. He laid them out on my dining room table, which had become our de facto war room. "Here's the pattern," he said, pointing to a series of transactions in the budget. "Look, landscape maintenance, emergency tree service, right-of-way clearing, all paid to one company, Bishop Property Services." "Bishop?" I asked. "Her husband's name is Frank Bishop," David confirmed, "but he's a plumber. He doesn't do landscaping. Her brother-in-law, however, a guy named Rick Snyder, started a property management company about 2 years ago. I'm willing to bet Bishop Property Services is just a shell name for Rick's company." It was a classic case of self-dealing. Karen was using her position as president to funnel HOA funds to her own family member, likely for inflated prices or for services that were never even rendered. The tree removal was almost certainly the biggest and most blatant example. She didn't get a board vote for the expenditure because she knew it wouldn't pass scrutiny, David explained. She just authorized the payment herself, probably disguised it as some other line item, and hoped no one would notice. "This is fraud, John, plain and simple." Marcus's eyes lit up when we presented him with David's files. "This is the heart of the case," he said, tapping a stack of invoices from Bishop Property Services. "The trees are the emotional core, the thing a jury will get angry about. This," he held up the invoices, "is the cold, hard proof of a corrupt enterprise. This is what we use to prove a pattern of racketeering. It elevates the case from a simple property dispute to something much more serious." Our next step was to formally notify the HOA's insurance carrier. Every HOA carries directors and officers, D&O, liability insurance to protect board members from lawsuits arising from their decisions. Marcus drafted another letter, this one addressed to the insurance company's legal department, with a copy sent to the HOA board. It was a summary of our impending lawsuit, including the timber trespass claim for $260,000, with the explicit mention of treble damages, the breach of fiduciary duty, and now the evidence of potential fraud and self-dealing. The insurance company has a right to know what kind of liability their insured has exposed them to, Marcus said with a wry smile. And more importantly, they have a duty to investigate. They are not going to be happy that the board president took unilateral, multi-thousand-dollar action without a vote, in violation of their own bylaws, and hired her own family to do the job. Insurance companies hate that kind of reckless behavior. It's what makes their premiums go up. This letter was the strategic equivalent of turning an enemy's own logistics against them. The insurance company was the HOA's financial backstop, their safety net. By alerting them, we were forcing them to scrutinize Karen's actions, not as her ally, but as her paymaster. They would launch their own investigation, and their lawyers would be far more ruthless and effective than we could ever be. Karen, blinded by her own self-importance, likely saw this as just another legal threat to be ignored. She couldn't comprehend that the very institution designed to protect her was about to become her most formidable adversary. She had built her kingdom on a foundation of flimsy rules and fear. She had ignored the fine print, and now the fine print, in the form of insurance clauses and fiduciary duties, was about to come to life and devour her. The board was fracturing, the evidence was secure, and the financial backers were on high alert. All the pieces were in place. It was time to take the fight public. The battlefield was now set for the decisive engagement. We had the evidence, we had the legal framework, and we had sown discord among the enemy's ranks. The next step, as Marcus advised, was to move the conflict out of the shadows of legal letters and into the open forum of the community itself. We needed to formally strip Karen of her power base, the silent, intimidated majority of homeowners. According to the HOA bylaws, a special meeting of the membership could be called by a petition signed by just 15% of the homeowners. It was a clause Karen had likely never worried about, confident that no one would ever have the organization or the courage to invoke it. With the help of Tom Miller and Mrs. Gable, we began to canvass the neighborhood. It was a delicate operation. I didn't approach people with anger or a thirst for vengeance. I approached them as a fellow neighbor, armed with facts and a quiet resolve. I showed them a simple one-page summary Marcus had drafted, outlining the procedural violations Karen had committed, the lack of notice, the denial of appeal rights, the unapproved expenditure that had put them all at financial risk. I told them Tom's story about his daughter's swing set. I told them Mrs. Gable's story about her gnomes. And then I told them my story, not with rage, but with a quiet sadness, explaining that the trees had been a living memorial to my wife. The response was a slow but steady awakening. People who had suffered in silence for years, convinced they were alone, began to realize they were part of a pattern. The fear Karen had cultivated began to be replaced by a shared sense of indignation. Within a week, we had signatures from over 40 households, more than double the number required. We followed the bylaws to the letter. David Chen, using his knowledge of the official procedures, drafted the petition and the meeting notice. We submitted it to the board secretary, Brenda, via certified mail, giving the required 21 days notice and clearly stating the agenda. A vote of no confidence in President Karen Bishop and a discussion of recent unapproved expenditures and procedural violations by the board. Karen had no legal way to refuse the meeting. To do so would be another blatant violation of the bylaws, and with the insurance company now watching, she couldn't risk it. The meeting was set for a Thursday evening in the community clubhouse, a sterile beige room that was the heart of Karen's empire. This was to be her Waterloo. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. More residents than had ever attended an HOA meeting before filled the cheap folding chairs. You could feel the tension in the air, a thick, palpable mixture of curiosity, fear, and anger. Karen sat at the head table, flanked by her loyalists, Gary and Brenda. She tried to project an aura of calm authority, but I could see the tightness around her mouth, the slight tremor in her hand as she shuffled her papers. She had underestimated the rebellion. She opened the meeting by trying to control the narrative, launching into a prepared speech about outside agitators and frivolous complaints that threatened their peaceful community. But this time, the crowd wasn't buying it. When she tried to dismiss the petition as improper, David Chen stood up. "Point of order, Madam President," he said, his voice clear and confident. "The petition was submitted in accordance with Bylaw 18.2. Furthermore, this meeting must be conducted according to Robert's Rules of Order as stipulated in our governing documents. The first item on the agenda is the motion presented by the petitioners. I yield the floor to Mr. John Davis." All eyes turned to me. I walked slowly to the front of the room, not to the podium, but to an easel I had set up earlier. On it was a large foam board, covered by a sheet. I took a deep breath, looked out at the faces of my neighbors, and began. I didn't shout, I didn't accuse. I simply told the story. I started with a picture of my house as it used to be, with the 4 magnificent walnut trees forming a green cathedral over the lawn. I then flipped the page to a stark, brutal photo of the 4 stumps. A collective gasp went through the room. This is what was done to my property in the middle of the night, without notice, without permission, I said, my voice steady. President Bishop has claimed she did this under her authority, but our own rules, the rules we all agree to live by, say otherwise. I then walked them through it, step by methodical step. I had enlarged copies of the bylaws on separate boards. I showed them Section 12.1, the requirement for 14 days written notice. Did anyone here who has ever been cited by the HOA receive proper written notice, or just a fine out of the blue? Hands went up all over the room. I showed them Section 15.8, the requirement for a board vote on any expenditure over $5,000. I held up the official quote from the arborist. Dr. Alistair Evans, a certified master arborist, appraised the timber value of my trees at a conservative $260,000. The cost to remove them was, without question, over the $5,000 limit. Yet there is no record of a board vote authorizing this expense. This means every one of you is now on the hook for a liability that was created in violation of our own rules. I turned to the next board, which had copies of the invoices from Bishop Property Services. And where did this unapproved expenditure go? To a company that shares the president's name, operated by her brother-in-law, a clear conflict of interest in potential fraud. The room was silent, the air crackling with stunned anger. Karen was sputtering, trying to interrupt, but David kept calmly citing Robert's Rules of Order, shutting her down. Finally, I turned to my last board. It was covered with photos. Lily Miller's empty yard, Mrs. Gable's gnomes, a dozen other small violations of personal freedom. This isn't just about my trees, I said, my voice rising with controlled passion. It's about a pattern of abuse. It's about a president who uses our rules not to build community, but to bully her neighbors. She has fined an elderly woman for her garden ornaments. She has taken away a disabled child's joy. She has done this because she believes her power is absolute. Tonight we have a chance to show her that it is not. The power in this community belongs to us, the homeowners. I urge you to vote yes on the motion of no confidence. I sat down. The silence was deafening. Then Tom Miller stood up, then Mrs. Gable, then others. They didn't make speeches. They just stood, a silent, powerful testament of solidarity. The vote was a landslide. Over 90% of the room voted to express no confidence in Karen Bishop. It wasn't a legally binding removal, but it was a massive public repudiation of her authority. Her face, which had gone from red to a pasty white, was a mask of disbelief and fury. She had lost control of her kingdom, and as she sat there stunned and isolated, a woman at the back of the room quietly slipped out. I recognized her as the daughter of the Miller family. She was a journalism student, and she had her phone out, recording. The public humiliation was just the beginning. The story was about to go viral. The community meeting was the turning point, the moment the private war became a public spectacle. The Miller's daughter, a savvy journalism student named Chloe, had not only recorded my entire presentation, but had also conducted brief emotional interviews with her father and Mrs. Gable immediately afterward. She edited the clips together into a tight, powerful 5-minute video package. She wrote a concise, factual article to accompany it, focusing on the most compelling elements: the decorated veteran, the desecrated memorial trees, the staggering $260,000 valuation, the disabled child's swing set, the elderly widow's gnomes, and the HOA president's blatant self-dealing. She posted it on a local community news blog and shared the link on the neighborhood's Facebook page and several regional news forums. The story exploded. Within hours, it was the most read article on the blog. By the next morning, it had been picked up by a reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer. By noon, a producer from WRAL, the largest TV news station in the Triangle, had called me asking for an on-camera interview. Marcus advised me to accept. Keep it simple, John. Be yourself. Factual, calm, dignified. Let the facts speak for themselves. You're the perfect sympathetic figure. Let Karen be the villain. The TV crew arrived that afternoon. They filmed me standing in front of the empty space where my trees had been, the afternoon light casting long shadows. I spoke calmly about Sarah, about what the trees meant to us, and about the methodical way I had tried to address the issue through proper channels. They interviewed Tom Miller, who spoke eloquently about the impact on his daughter. They even got a short, heartbreaking soundbite from Mrs. Gable, who clutched one of her remaining gnomes and said, "She took my George's memories away." The news segment aired that night at 6 p.m. It was the lead story. The headline was stark and effective. Veterans' $260,000 memorial trees illegally destroyed by power-hungry HOA president. They showed the pictures of my beautiful trees, then the brutal stumps. They showed the clip of my speech at the community meeting. They showed the invoices for Bishop Property Services. And they showed Karen, caught off guard by a reporter earlier that day, refusing to comment and slamming her door in the camera's face. The story was a Molotov cocktail thrown into the placid world of suburban governance. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The news station's website was flooded with comments, almost universally condemning Karen and the HOA. The story was shared thousands of times on social media. It tapped into a deep well of public resentment against overreaching HOAs everywhere. People saw their own struggles, their own petty tyrants, reflected in Karen's actions. I became an unwilling symbol of every homeowner who had ever been fined for a mismatched mailbox or a slightly too long lawn. But the most important viewer of that news segment wasn't a sympathetic homeowner. It was an executive in the risk management department of North State Mutual, the company that held the HOA's directors and officers' liability policy. The moment the story aired, their office was thrown into chaos. An HOA president unilaterally authorizing a $250,000 liability, in violation of her own bylaws, by hiring her own relative, and then having it all blow up on the evening news was their worst-case scenario. It was a textbook example of a bad faith action, the kind of thing that could lead a court to pierce the corporate veil and hold board members personally liable, or even award punitive damages not covered by the policy. The next morning, Marcus received a call. It was from a senior partner at a major Charlotte law firm, the outside counsel for North State Mutual. The tone was not friendly or conciliatory. It was the sound of controlled corporate rage. "Mr. Thorne," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with ice, "we have, of course, seen the news reports regarding your client, Mr. Davis, and the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. We are launching a full and immediate investigation into the matter. We were not made aware of the particulars of this situation by our insured. The actions taken by Ms. Bishop, as alleged, appear to be grossly outside the scope of her authority and the terms of our policy." Marcus just listened, a slight smile on his face. The insurance company was already distancing itself from Karen, preparing to throw her under the bus to save themselves. The lawyer continued, "We need to understand the full scope of your impending action. We need to see the arborist report, the invoices you've uncovered, the witness statements. We need everything. Our position is that if President Bishop acted without the board's knowledge and consent, in direct violation of the covenants she was sworn to uphold, then she was not acting in her official capacity, and our duty to indemnify her personally may be limited." It was the checkmate move. The insurance company was signaling that they were prepared to argue Karen was on her own. Their duty was to the HOA as an entity, and Karen's reckless actions had jeopardized that entity. To protect the HOA in their own financial interests, they would have to sever Karen from the herd and leave her to the wolves. Marcus agreed to cooperate fully, promising to forward the entire file. When he hung up the phone, he was beaming. "They're going to do our job for us," he said. "They're going to tear her apart from the inside out. Their investigation will be swift and brutal. They have to mitigate their losses, and the easiest way to do that is to prove their own insured acted so recklessly that she isn't covered. Karen had started a war with me, but she had ended up in a war with a multi-billion-dollar insurance corporation. It was a fight she could not possibly win. The public shaming was complete. The financial backers had turned on her. All that remained was the final, formal removal from power and the legal judgment that would seal her fate. The wheels of justice were now grinding, and they were grinding directly towards her. The arrival of the insurance company's investigator was like the appearance of a hawk in a pigeon coop. He was a quiet, unassuming man in a gray suit named Mr. Heller, but he moved with an aura of absolute, unimpeachable authority. He wasn't there to negotiate or mediate. He was there to conduct a forensic analysis of a disaster and assign blame. He requested an emergency meeting of the HOA board, and this time, there was no pretense of Karen being in charge. The notice came from North State Mutual's legal counsel. The meeting was mandatory. It was held not in the clubhouse, but in a small, soulless conference room at a nearby office park. Neutral ground. I was not invited, but Marcus was, as legal counsel for the primary claimant. David Chen was also requested to attend as a witness with knowledge of past financial practices. The atmosphere, as Marcus later recounted, was funereal. The board members, Gary, Brenda, and the two others who had been Karen's silent enablers, sat on one side of the table, looking pale and terrified. Karen sat slightly apart from them, a failed attempt at projecting defiance that only highlighted her isolation. Mr. Heller and a sharp-eyed lawyer from the insurance company sat opposite them. Heller began without preamble. He laid out the facts as his investigation had uncovered them, his voice a dry, emotionless monotone. He had the arborist's report valuing the trees at $260,000. He had a copy of the invoice from Bishop Property Services for $8,500 for the emergency removal. He had the HOA's bank statements showing the check had been paid out of the reserve fund. He had a copy of the CC and RS. "Ms. Bishop," he began, his eyes fixing on her, "our policy covers decisions made by the board in good faith. Can you please show me the minutes from the board meeting where the expenditure of $8,500 to remove Mr. Davis's trees was discussed and approved by a majority vote?" Karen stammered. "It was an emergency action. Bylaw 7.4 gives the committee sole discretion. Heller cut her off, his voice still flat, but with a new edge of steel. The bylaw you are referring to, Ms. Bishop, does not grant you, as an individual, the authority to spend from the reserve fund. That is governed by Section 15.8, which requires a board vote for any amount over $5,000. The other board members here, he gestured to Gary and Brenda, have all provided sworn statements that they were never consulted, nor did they vote on this expenditure. Is that correct? Gary and Brenda, seeing their own financial lives flashing before their eyes, nodded meekly. They had abandoned their queen. Heller continued, his methodical dismantling of her authority relentless. Furthermore, the company you hired, Bishop Property Services, is, we have discovered, a sole proprietorship registered to Mr. Rick Snyder, your brother-in-law. Did you disclose this familial relationship to the board and recuse yourself from the decision to hire him, as required by both state law and your own conflict of interest policy outlined in Section 19.3 of the bylaws? He gave us a good price, Karen blurted out, a desperate, pathetic defense. The insurance company's lawyer finally spoke, her voice sharp and precise. Ms. Bishop, the price is irrelevant. The issue is one of fiduciary duty and prohibited self-dealing. You used your position of power to enrich a family member with community funds without authorization. This is not a good faith action. This is, at best, gross negligence, and at worst, fraud. The room was silent. The full weight of her actions was finally crashing down on Karen, not as a matter of neighborhood squabbles, but as a cold, hard legal reality. Mr. Heller then delivered the ultimatum. North State Mutual's position is as follows, he stated, looking at each board member in turn. The actions taken by President Bishop were unilateral, unauthorized, and conducted in bad faith. They were taken outside the scope of her duties as an officer of this association. Therefore, our duty to indemnify her for the consequences of these specific actions is void. However, the HOA as an entity and you as board members are still exposed to a significant lawsuit. He let that sink in. He had just officially thrown Karen to the wolves. We are prepared, he continued, to defend the HOA and its remaining board members and to negotiate a settlement with Mr. Davis under the terms of your policy. However, this offer is contingent on one non-negotiable condition, the immediate removal of Karen Bishop from the presidency and from the board of directors entirely. If she remains in any position of authority, we will be forced to issue a reservation of rights letter and may deny the claim altogether, leaving the association and each of you personally liable for the full judgment, which, given the evidence for treble damages, could exceed $750,000 plus legal fees. It was a masterstroke of corporate power. He had presented them with a choice: get rid of Karen or face financial ruin. The fear in the room was so thick you could taste it. Gary, the car salesman, was the first to break. I make a motion, he stammered, his voice trembling, to remove Karen Bishop as president, effective immediately. Brenda, her face ashen, seconded the motion without even looking at Karen. Heller called for the vote. Gary, Brenda, and the other two board members all raised their hands. It was unanimous. Karen just sat there, her face a crumpled mask of shock and betrayal. In the space of 10 minutes, her entire kingdom, the one she had ruled with an iron fist for years, had been dissolved. She was no longer President Bishop. She was just Karen, a private citizen facing a massive lawsuit with no institutional protection. The board will need to formally ratify this vote at a public meeting and notify the homeowners, the insurance lawyer added, and you will issue a formal, written apology to Mr. Davis. We will handle the settlement negotiations from here. As the meeting broke up, Karen stood, her eyes blazing with a desperate, hateful fire. She looked at me, then at Marcus. You did this, she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. You ruined this community. No, Karen, I replied, my voice calm and even. You did. You built this house of cards yourself. I just gave it the push it needed to fall. She stormed out of the room, stripped of her power, her title, her allies, and her immunity. It was a complete and total reversal. She had tried to crush me with the weight of the HOA's authority, and in the end, that same authority, in the form of its insurer, had been the instrument of her own destruction. The war was over. All that remained was to tally the cost and rebuild. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The HOA board, now terrified into compliance by the insurance company, held a perfunctory public meeting where they formally ratified the vote to remove Karen. She didn't even show up. They elected David Chen as the interim president, a move that sent a clear signal of a new era of transparency and fairness. The board, under David's guidance and with the full backing of the insurer, immediately began to dismantle Karen's reign of terror. They issued a formal retraction of all fines levied against Mrs. Gable and sent her a check for the full amount she had paid. They sent a letter to the Miller family, formally apologizing and inviting them to submit a new plan for a compliant, custom-built swing set for Lily, promising to expedite its approval. The oppressive cloud that had hung over Oak Ridge Estates for years began to lift. In the legal arena, things moved just as quickly. North State Mutual's lawyers were eager to stanch the bleeding and avoid a protracted public court battle that would only uncover more embarrassing details. They approached Marcus with a settlement offer. Their initial offer was for the appraised timber value, $260,000 plus my legal fees. Marcus, in his own words, laughed them off the phone. "John," he told me, "they're testing us. They know we have them dead to rights on treble damages. We don't settle for a penny less than what the law allows for." He sent back a counter demand, $780,000, representing 3 times the value of the timber as allowed under the North Carolina Timber Trespass Statute, plus an additional sum for punitive damages related to the gross negligence and fraud, in full reimbursement of all legal and expert witness fees. The total demand was just over $1 million. The insurance company balked, but they knew we held all the cards. After a week of tense negotiation, they agreed. The final settlement was for $950,000. The insurance policy had a limit of $500,000 for this type of claim. That meant the HOA was responsible for the remaining $450,000. But the settlement had another crucial component, one Marcus had insisted on. It stipulated that the judgment was against the HOA and Karen Bishop, personally and jointly. This meant that if the HOA couldn't pay, the creditor, me, could go after Karen's personal assets. The HOA, facing a $450,000 bill, had to levy a massive special assessment on all the homeowners. It was a painful but necessary consequence. It was the price of their years of apathy, of allowing a tyrant to rule them unopposed. But now, under David's leadership, the reason for the assessment was explained with full transparency. It wasn't to fund Karen's vendettas, it was to pay for the damage she had caused. The community, angry but understanding, paid it. They understood it was the cost of buying back their freedom. The HOA's portion was paid. But that still left Karen. The insurance company, having paid out their policy limit, immediately filed their own lawsuit against Karen to recoup their losses, arguing she had acted in bad faith and voided her coverage. She was now being sued by me and by her own former insurer. She was financially cornered, with no allies and no resources. Within 6 months, a for sale sign went up on her immaculate lawn. She was forced to sell her oversized house to pay her share of the judgment and her mounting legal bills. The last I saw of her, she was supervising a moving truck, her face a permanent mask of bitter resentment. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at any of her former neighbors. She just got in her car and drove away, leaving behind the community she had tried so hard to control, a pariah in her own fallen kingdom. Justice had been served, but the story doesn't end with her defeat. It ends with what came next. The money from the settlement was a staggering amount, far more than I ever needed or wanted. It felt like blood money, paid for with the lives of my trees. I couldn't just put it in the bank. It had to mean something. It had to rebuild what had been destroyed. I took a significant portion of the settlement and established a trust, the Oak Ridge Community and Legacy Fund. Its first project was to transform the barren patch of my front yard into a small park, a community space open to everyone. I hired a landscape architect and we designed a beautiful public garden. We planted new trees, oaks, maples, and in the 4 corners, as a tribute, 4 young black walnut saplings. We built benches and a winding stone path. In the center, we placed a simple bronze plaque. It didn't mention Karen or the lawsuit. It just said, The Sarah Davis Memorial Grove. May this be a place of peace and community. Planted 2023. The rest of the money in the fund was used to create grants for the neighborhood. We paid for a brand new, state-of-the-art playground in the common area, with a special section designed by Tom Miller himself, featuring an even better version of the adaptive swing he had first built for Lily. We created a fund to help elderly residents with home and yard maintenance, ensuring no one like Mrs. Gable would ever be threatened with fines for falling behind. The new HOA, under David's leadership, went through the CC and RS, and with community input, systematically eliminated every vague, petty, and oppressive rule. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to community support. The beige tyranny was over, replaced by a neighborhood that was vibrant, diverse, and alive. One evening, about a year after the trees were cut, I was sitting on one of the benches in the new Memorial Grove. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow on the new saplings. Tom and Jenna Miller were there, pushing a laughing Lily on her new swing. Mrs. Gable was walking the stone path with a friend, pointing out the different flowers. The anger and the grief that had fueled me for so long were gone, replaced by a quiet, profound sense of peace. I had lost my trees, my living connection to my wife. But in their place, something new had grown. A community had been reborn. We had faced down a bully, not with rage and violence, but with discipline, unity, and the relentless application of the law. We had turned a vicious act of destruction into a catalyst for creation. The 4 young walnut trees stood silhouetted against the twilight sky, small but resilient. They were a promise that even in the face of petty tyranny and senseless destruction, what is good and right can, with patience and resolve, take root and grow again, stronger than before.